You know, the phrase servant leadership is very familiar in ministry settings. It's tossed around a lot. But while it's very familiar, I really think it's misunderstood. We tend to think of servant leadership as sort of this leadership style, somebody who's really caring and maybe hugs people a lot. But that's not what servant leadership is. Servant leadership isn't a style, it's an action. It's the mechanism by which we lead. Servant leadership is the blocking and tackling of being a leader in a church or a ministry setting. If we look in scripture, there's several places where this comes out. One of the most famous is John 13, where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. Afterward, he stands up and says, "You know what? You call me Lord and teacher, and that's appropriate because that's who I am. But here I am as Lord and teacher. I've just washed your feet. So I've set you an example that you should follow." Another passage to consider is Matthew chapter 20 and Mark chapter 10. Jesus says, "You know what? If you want to be great in the kingdom, you need to be a servant. If you want to be considered first, you need to consider yourself as a slave, as someone who basically has no rights and no privileges." Another passage where this comes up is Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus says, if don't be like the Pharisees. Don't be like some super spiritual person or a master teacher is the final authority or some kind of spiritual guru that everybody looks to as a guide. Instead, just be yourselves, be your brothers. You're on and sisters, you're on equal plane. So it's interesting that while Jesus made servant leadership a priority, he didn't make it a command. He made it a choice. He said, "You'll be blessed if you do these things." Now, there's several implications that comes from that. One, we need to choose what leadership model we're following. There's lots of models out there. Which one are you following that will help you be a servant leader? Second, and this is a tricky one, you need to consider abandoning all the authority that comes from your position. In other words, if you're in a ministry setting, you're a pastor, senior pastor, you're the executive leader at the top of an organizational, a hierarchical organization. Well, how can you be a slave when you're in a structure that elevates you, that esteems you, that makes you a VIP? You have to work extra hard to avoid the very thing that Jesus said not to do. Now, I can tell you from being in a disciple-making movement approach that there is no hierarchical structure. It's a network structure. So whatever influence you have as a leader comes through serving and equipping. It's not about what competencies you have. It's about what competencies you're passing on to those that you lead. Your authority comes from a history of disciple-making ministry, of serving people, and in that setting, you earn the right to lead and to have authority. So just to consider, what can we do with all this? There's several things that I want to offer. One, think about what leadership example you're following. What's your ideal leader look like, and is that person really acting out servant leadership? Secondly, and the kind of flip side to that is, what leadership example are you setting? How will those that you lead learn about servant leadership by watching you, by being led by you? And lastly, how will you adjust your leadership to abandon use of positional authority? And this is going to be a challenge, like I said earlier. But just to think about how that impacts you. I invite you to think back over the last 30 days. Take stock of everything that happened, every conversation you had, every communication you participated in, every strategy you proposed, all of it. Lunch meetings, side conversations, one-on-one conversations. And think back, and in each one of these settings, ask yourself one of two things. Ask yourself this, and you have one of two answers. What did I use to influence in that situation? What did I use in my leadership? Was it my title and all the power and privilege and authority that comes with that title? Or was it the relational capital that I had because of the time and investment I'd made in serving these people? If you only have one of those two options, which one is it? If you think back and see the big picture, that'll help give you a sense of what are you what are you using? What's your mechanism of leadership? And hopefully it'll reveal maybe some first steps that you can take toward becoming more of a servant leader. I hope this is helpful to you, and God bless.